The Eustace Diamonds by Anthony Trollope. Chapter 44, A Midnight Adventure. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Bethany Simpson. Something as to the jewels had been told to Lord George, and this was quite necessary, as Lord George intended to travel with the ladies from Portray to London. Of course, he had heard of the diamonds, as who had not? He had heard, too, of Lord Fawn, and knew why it was that Lord Fawn had peremptorily refused to carry out his engagement. But till he was told by Mrs. Carbuncle, he did not know that the diamonds were then kept within the castle, nor did he understand that it would be part of his duty to guard them on their way back to London. "They are worth ever so much, ain't they?" he said to Mrs. Carbuncle, when she first gave him the information. £10,000, said Mrs. Carbuncle, almost with awe. "I don't believe a word of it," said Lord George. "She says that they've been valued at that since she's had them." Lord George owned to himself that such a necklace was worth having, as also no doubt were Portray Castle and the income arising from the estate, even though they could be held in possession for only a single life. Hitherto in his very checkered career he had escaped the trammels of matrimony, and among his many modes of life had hardly even suggested to himself the expediency of taking a wife with a fortune, and then settling down for the future, if submissively, still comfortably. To say that he had never looked forward to such a marriage as a possible future arrangement would probably be incorrect. To men such as Lord George it is too easy a result of a career to be altogether banished from the mind. But no attempt had ever yet been made, nor had any special lady ever been so far honoured in his thoughts as to be connected in them with any vague ideas which he might have formed on the subject. But now it did occur to him that Portray Castle was a place in which he could pass 2 or 3 months annually without ennui, and that if he were to marry, little Lizzie Eustace could do as well as any other woman with money whom he might chance to meet. He did not say all this to anybody, and therefore cannot be accused of vanity. He was the last man in the world to speak on such a subject to anyone, and as our Lizzie certainly bestowed upon him many of her smiles, much of her poetry, and some of her confidence, it cannot be said that he was not justified in his views. But then she was such, quote, an infernal little liar. Lord George was quite able to discover so much of her. "She does lie, certainly," said Mrs. Carbuncle. "But then who doesn't?" On the morning of their departure, the box with the diamonds was brought down into the hall just as they were about to depart. The tall London footman again brought it down and deposited it on one of the oak hall chairs, as though it were a thing so heavy that he could hardly stagger along with it. How Lizzie did hate the man as she watched him, and regret that she had not attempted to carry it down herself. She had been with her diamonds that morning, and had seen them out of the box and into it. A few days passed on which she did not handle them and gaze at them. Mrs. Carbuncle had suggested that the box with all her diamonds in it might be stolen from her, and as she thought of this her heart almost sank within her. When she had them once again in London, she would take some steps to relieve herself from this embarrassment of carrying about with her so great a burden of care. The man, with a vehement show of exertion, deposited the box on the chair, and then groaned aloud. Lizzie knew very well that she could lift the box of her own unaided exertions, and that the groan was at any rate unnecessary. "Supposing some one were to steal on the way," said Lord George to her, not in his pleasantest tone. "Do not suggest anything so horrible," said Lizzie, trying to laugh. "I shouldn't like it at all," said Lord George. "I don't think it would make me a bit unhappy. You've heard about it all. There never was such a persecution. I often say that I should be well pleased to take the bauble and fling it into the ocean waves." "I should like to be a mermaid and catch it," said Lord George. "And what better would you be? Such things are all vanity and vexation of spirit. I hate the shining thing." And she hit the box with the whip that she held in her hand. It had been arranged that the party should sleep at Carlisle. It consisted of Lord George, the 3 ladies, the tall manservant, Lord George's own man, and the 2 maids. Miss Macnulty, with the heir and the nurses, were to remain at Portray for yet a while longer. The iron box was again put into the carriage, and was used by Lizzie as a footstool. This might have been very well, had there been no necessity for changing their train. At Troon, the porter behaved well and did not struggle much as he carried it from the carriage onto the platform. But at Kilmarnock, where they met the train from Glasgow, the big footman interfered again, and the scene was performed under the eyes of a crowd of people. It seemed to Lizzie that Lord George almost encouraged the struggling, as though he were in league with the footman to annoy her. But there was no further change between Kilmarnock and Carlisle, and they managed to make themselves very comfortable. Lunch had been provided, for Mrs. Carbuncle was a woman who cared for such things, and Lord George also liked a glass of champagne in the middle of the day. Lizzie professed to be perfectly indifferent on such matters, but nevertheless she enjoyed her lunch and allowed Lord George to press upon her a second and perhaps a portion of a third glass of wine. Even Lucinda was roused up from her general state of apathy and permitted herself to forget Sir Griffin for a while. During this journey to Carlisle, Lizzie Eustace almost made up her mind that Lord George was the very Corsair she had been expecting ever since she had mastered Lord Byron's great poem. He had a way of doing things and of saying things, of proclaiming himself to be master, and at the same time of making himself thoroughly agreeable to his dependents, and especially to the one dependent whom he most honoured at the time, which exactly suited Lizzie's ideas of what a man should be. And then he possessed that utter indifference to all conventions and laws, which is the great prerogative of Corsairs. He had no reverence for aught divine or human, which is a great thing. The Queen and Parliament, the bench of bishops, and even the police were to him just so many fungi and parasites and noxious vapours and false hypocrites. Such were the names by which he ventured to call these bugbears of the world. It was so delightful to live with a man who himself had a title of his own, but who could speak of dukes and marquises as being quite despicable by reason of their absurd position. And as they became gay and free after their luncheon, he expressed almost as much contempt for honesty as for dukes, and showed clearly that he regarded matrimony and marquises to be equally vain and useless. "How dare you say such things in our hearing?" exclaimed Mrs. Carbuncle. "I assert that if men and women were really true, no vows would be needed, and if no vows, then no marriage vows. Do you believe such vows are kept?" "Yes," said Mrs. Carbuncle enthusiastically. "I don't," said Lucinda. "Nor I," said the Corsair. "Who can believe that a woman will always love her husband because she swears she will? The oath is false on the face of it." "But women must marry," said Lizzie. The Corsair declared freely that he did not see any such necessity. And then, though it could hardly be said that this Corsair was a handsome man, still he had fine Corsair's eyes, full of expression and determination, eyes that could look love and bloodshed almost at the same time. And then he had those manly properties, power, bigness, and apparent boldness, which belonged to a Corsair. To be hurried about the world by such a man, treated sometimes with crushing severity, and at others with the tenderest love, not to be spoken to for one fortnight, and then to be embraced perpetually for another, to be cast every now and then into some abyss of despair by his rashness, and then raised to a pinnacle of human joy by his courage. That, thought Lizzie, would be the kind of life which would suit her poetical temperament. But then how would it be with her if the Corsair were to take to hurrying about the world without carrying her with him, and were to do so always at her expense? Perhaps he might hurry about the world and take somebody else with him. Medora, if Lizzie remembered rightly, had had no jointure or private fortune. But yet a woman must risk something if the spirit of poetry is to be allowed any play at all. "And now these weary diamonds again," said Lord George, as the carriage was stopped against the Carlisle platform. "I suppose they must go into your bedroom, Lady Eustace." "I wish you'd let the man put the box in yours, just for this night," said Lizzie. "No, not if I know it," said Lord George. And then he explained. Such property would be quite as liable to be stolen when in his custody as it would in hers, but if stolen while in his, would entail upon him a grievous vexation that would by no means lessen the effect of her loss. She did not understand him, but finding that he was quite in earnest, she directed that the box should be again taken to her own chamber. Lord George suggested that it should be entrusted to the landlord, and for a moment or two Lizzie submitted to the idea, but she stood for that moment thinking of it, and then decided that the box should go to her own room. "There's no knowing what that Mr. Camperdown mightn't do," she whispered to Lord George. The porter and the tall footman between them staggered along under their load, and the iron box was again deposited in the bedroom of the Carlisle inn. The evening at Carlisle was spent